Hello everyone, my name is Carrie Smith. Thank you for tuning into my presentation. For my final paper, I chose to write about responses. I compare unconditioned and conditioned responses. I provide examples of both of them, and I talk about how conditioning responses is used in applied behavior analysis today. Unconditioned responses are those that naturally occur to stimuli. Skinner explains that responding to stimuli are reflexes working. He also explains responding to stimuli as being brought about by the environment that gives us survival value. Some examples that I included in my paper of unconditioned responses would be if your hand touches a hot stove, you don't have to think or be conditioned to remove your hand. You immediately feel that it's hot and it's a natural reflex to then pull your hand away. Whenever somebody is cutting onions, an unconditioned response or a natural reflex would be for your eyes to start watering. Whenever seasoning or something of that nature goes into your nose, you automatically sneeze, which would be an unconditioned response or a natural reflex. A couple other examples that Skinner talked about that I included in my paper is whenever air is blown into your eyeball, that leads to an unconditioned response of a blink. And whenever you're at the doctor's office and the doctor is actually checking your reflexes, he tends to hit a hammer on your knee, which leads to a kick. That is also an unconditioned response. Conditioned responses are those responses that people are taught. A conditioned response would be a response that an individual learns over time. Conditioned reflexes are a process of substitution. Conditioned responses have proven to be successful across environments and across different stimuli. Pavlov was the first scientist to prove conditioned responses through his experiment with the dog and the bell. In my paper, I go over the attempts and trials he had to go through to realize how much extra stimuli was presented. He originally went in and handed the dog the food at the sound of the bell. So the dog conditioned seeing a lab coat with getting fed rather than hearing the sound of the bell. So there were a couple different trials where Pavlov had to rearrange his environment to make sure that the dog didn't hear any contact with the experimenter or he didn't smell any outside smells. He ended up making it so that a lever actually dropped the food in at the tone of the bell. So that way there was nothing else in there in the experimental room that could have contributed to the dog producing saliva. So eventually, whenever the dog heard the bell, even without the food being present, he produced saliva, and that was Pavlov's original example of conditioning a response. He conditioned producing saliva to the sound of the bell. In applied behavioral analysis, there are tons of examples of how we as therapists condition responses. Some of these examples are through discrete trial training. We condition responses for labeling pictures, for matching pictures, learning different feature, function, and class of different items, different discrimination techniques. This is all pairing reinforcement with conditioned responses so that we can teach our kids how to respond appropriately. Applied behavior analysis also helps to condition responses to certain questions and phrases. It also helps to teach a kid how to sit at circle time or act appropriately in public, discriminate between when self-stimulatory behaviors are acceptable and when they're not. Toilet training, learning social behaviors and reading social cues, stuff of that nature, and so much more. Some scholarly examples that I provided were a rat example that I found an article on. A rat was placed in a chamber and received foot shock through the floor. Whenever he was placed back into that chamber, the rat froze and kind of like didn't want to move at all. When he was placed in a new chamber, he ran freely. And then whenever he was placed back in the old chamber, he immediately had that conditioned response to freeze up again, because that one particular chamber he associated with his feet getting shocked, and that became the conditioned response to being placed in that chamber. Another example that I found out of Sage University was a survey example. And basically it goes over that the more experience that you have taking a survey, the more likely that you are to answer don't know rather than actually answering the question. This has been conditioned over time for the folks that are taking the survey. They don't want follow-up questions, and they want to reach their reinforcement, which would be escaping the survey. So they are as brief as possible, and it actually leads them to be more dishonest in completing the survey just because they don't want to do it anymore. Some TV examples that I included were Barney conditions Marshall to want hibachi food whenever he sneezes. That's a long process. And in an episode of The Office, Jim restarts his computer repetitively and gives Dwight an Altoid mint every time, till eventually, when Jim restarts his computer, Dwight just reaches out for the Altoid mint. In conclusion, there are some conflicting views on what comes naturally to us. Things that people believe to be natural responses have been proven to be conditioned through scientific experiment in both human and in animals alike. Conditioned responses are those taught to people through their experiences. They are more easily taught and learned when paired with reinforcing consequences. The technique of reinforcement has been studied, used, and proven in past decades. Conditioned responses have been proven to be successful across environments and stimuli. This powerful tool of conditioning will surely continue to help teach for many years to come. These are the references from my paper that I chose to include in this PowerPoint presentation. Thank you guys so much for watching and for all the support throughout this class. I wish you guys the best of luck through the remainder of your studies and in your career.